Good morning. I'm Joyce Tischler, your worship associate this morning. And I brought some things for show and tell. When I was a young child, I really liked the holiday of Passover. It meant a big family gathering and this really kind of curious ceremonial dinner. Passover, as we'll be discussing, is a celebration of the biblical story of Exodus, recounting how the Jews who suffered as slaves got their freedom and left Egypt. For me as a kid, it seemed very distant from what I experienced in 20th century New York City, and it was all about the food for me. The centerpiece of Passover is a dinner called a Seder, in which there are ceremonial foods, and we'd read from a special ceremonial text called the Haggadah. And the Haggadah tells the story of Exodus. Now, if you came from the wrong family, it could take 4 hours to get through the Haggadah. Yeah, and you would probably get really hungry by the time they were done. Luckily, I came from a family that cut to the chase. Our dining room was very small, but somehow the table was always big enough to fit all of us. My parents, my brother, my sister, me, grandparents, Aunt Sarah, Aunt Sadie. And you're supposed to leave an empty chair for an angel named Elijah. He never showed up. In addition to the Haggadah, we had, hang on, wait for it. Okay, there we go. A ceremonial plate. And each little divot in this ceremonial plate held a ceremonial food. There was karpas, which is a vegetable, oftentimes parsley, that symbolizes spring and rebirth. There would be a roasted egg to represent the birth of the Jewish people after they fled slavery. In my family, my mom would boil up a dozen eggs, didn't roast them, and you got to dip them in salt water, which is really delicious. If you haven't tried it, I recommend it. Haroset is another one of my favorite foods that was on the plate. It's made from chopped up apples, chopped up walnuts, cinnamon, a little bit of wine, and it symbolizes the mortar that the Israelite slaves used to make bricks for the Egyptian buildings. But it tastes surprisingly good. I know that doesn't sound good, but it's actually very sweet and delicious. There would be a roasted shank bone from a lamb to represent the Passover offering. For those of us who no longer eat lamb, we put a roasted beet there instead. Maror is a bitter herb. It was usually horseradish. It symbolizes the bitterness of slavery. It also really clears your head. Chazaret is another bitter vegetable to symbolize slavery. A modern feminist addition to this plate is an orange, right? I don't know if you've heard that. The orange responds to the Jewish rabbis who said that when a woman is allowed to be a rabbi, there will be an orange on the Seder plate. Yeah. So after the ceremony, we would enjoy a wonderful family meal with matzo ball soup. If you haven't tried it, give yourself a treat, and other delights. But it wasn't until years later that I actually began to think about the meaning, the deeper meaning of Passover. I had decided to hold a Seder in my own home. I was married to my beloved Irish Catholic husband, and I invited some friends over, and I was the only Jew in the room. And we were recounting, reading the Haggadah and recounting the slavery of the Jews. And all of a sudden, my husband started to cry. And he was not a touchy-feely kind of guy. So I was really surprised. I said, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "The slavery, it's just so sad." I thought, oh, wow. I brought one of the Passover foods. Actually, it's something I eat year-round. It's called matzah, and matzah is one of the most important foods of Passover. You can make it into matzo ball soup. My mom would send me to school with matzah sandwiches, peanut butter and jam and matzah, very sticky, tuna fish and matzah. It was very cool. You couldn't eat bread during that week, so matzah was everywhere. The origin of matzah is that the Jewish slaves had to get out of town fast. You saw the movie, right? They had to leave quickly. They didn't have time for the bread to rise, so they baked the unrisen bread and they took it with them into the desert for the next 40 years. Now, matzah is an acquired taste, I will admit. It's a lot like poi is to Hawaiians or Vegemite is to Australians. If you grew up eating it, you probably consider it comfort food. If you've never eaten it, it probably tastes like a very large, very bland cracker. I've put some matzah downstairs, and invite you to try it after the service. I recommend that you slather it with the butter that I've brought to ensure that it slides down the throat rather than getting stuck. But for me, the tour de force of the Passover Seder, and I did not bring it, was the Manischewitz Passover grape wine, which okay, if you can imagine a thick purplish liquid that tastes like vodka meets honey. As a little kid, I thought it was wickedly exciting to be able to drink wine. And then I took a sip.
Have you had a sip this morning?
To this day, I'm not a drinker. I want to wish you all a joyous Passover, Gut Yontif und a Sissen Pesach.
Our reading today is from Victoria Safford. It is from a book called Walking Toward Morning, and the reading is called Desert Spring Meditation. They had no idea where they were going when they left that night. In the dark, without lights, without shoes, without bread, their children smothered against them so they would make no noise. They had no idea what they were getting into following this Moses, this wild-eyed one who claimed visions and made promises, but who, after all, could guarantee them nothing except death if they were caught. They had no idea, these slaves, what it could mean, this promise of land, their own country, and life abundant. Of freedom, they knew nothing except what they could taste by living in its opposite, slavery. And that taste became a hunger. And that hunger became insatiable until they were ravenous for freedom. And they went out then, but no one knows to this day whether they were led by Moses or by the outstretched arm and mighty hand of something else, of something eternal, as they would afterward and always claim, or whether their own human hungry will made them flee that night from Pharaoh. They went into the wilderness, and then they wandered for 40 years, which in those days was an entire lifetime. So 40 was a good old age, and so many of them died before getting anywhere. And many were born in the desert and grew to adulthood, knowing nothing of the journey, not slavery, not freedom, just the going. They whined and complained and muttered, and some mutinied, for they were a stiff-necked and rebellious people. You can read it for yourself. Ungrateful people, even when manna rained down from heaven and quails were sent to feed them. Unhappy people, longing out loud even for the familiar security of Egypt, of all places, where at least they knew what to expect, as awful as it was. Impatient people, making cheap little idols and gods of metal to bargain with in secret when the traveling got hard or merely dull, and the days and years became monotonous. In the springtime, we remember the promised land is not a destination, it is a way of going. The land beyond the Jordan, that country of freedom and dignity and laughter, you carry it inside of you all the while. It is planted in your mind and heart already before you ever start out. Before it even occurs to you that in order to leave the life in Egypt, the intolerable bondage of that life, what you need to do is stand up and walk forward. Passover, or Pesach, one of the most important holidays for the Jewish people, begins on Wednesday night. It commemorates the Israelites' escape from slavery in Egypt when God sent a series of plagues to befall the people of Egypt to allow the slaves to become free. The story begins in the book of Exodus. The Israelites and the Egyptians had been getting along okay, but then a new Pharaoh came to power and was jealous of the Israelites because there were so many of them. And so he commanded the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill all the boy babies as they were born. But they were smart women, and they said, "I'm sorry, we can't help it. The Hebrew women are so strong, and they have the babies before we even arrive." And so he commanded that all of those boy babies be thrown into the Nile to drown. But in the most Trojan horse-like move in the Torah, a woman hid her baby for 3 months and then waterproofed a basket with pitch. And then she put the baby in the river near where the Pharaoh's own daughter was bathing. She sent her own daughter, whose name was Miriam, to watch and see what happened. And when Pharaoh's daughter pulled the baby out of the river and decided to raise it as her own, his sister appeared and asked if Pharaoh's daughter would like her to find a wet nurse for the baby because no one was making formula yet. And so this is how it was that Moses' mother got her own child back for the first few years. And after that, he was raised in the palace of the Pharaoh. And when he was older and he learned that he was Jewish by birth and he saw what was happening to the slaves. And once he came upon an Egyptian beating a slave, and Moses killed him. And he ran away, afraid of being punished. And after a long, long interlude where he got married and had sons, because there's a throwaway line in the Hebrew scriptures that he was 80 when the rest of this happened, God appeared to him in the form of a burning bush and said, "I am the God of your forefathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I have seen what has happened to my people, and you are going to go free them. Tell them I will lead my people out of bondage and bring them to a land of milk and honey." And Moses said, "No, I can't. Who would believe me?" And the Lord said, "Here, I have a few really good party tricks. Pick up your staff." So Moses picks up his staff, and it turned into a serpent in his hand, and Moses threw it on the ground and said, "Eek!" And the Lord rolled his eyes and said, "Pick it up by the tail." And it turned back into a staff. And then the Lord told him to put his hand into his shirt, and when he drew it out, it looked as though Moses had leprosy on his hand, but when he put it back in, his hand was healed. And God figured that that was the end of it, but Moses was still not convinced, and he said, "Lord, I beseech thee, I cannot, for I am not a good speaker. I am heavy of tongue." And the Lord rolled his eyes again and said, "Who gave you that tongue? Who made you?" But okay, fine, go get your brother Aaron to help, but you're the leader, and I will be with you both, and don't forget the staff. That's the key. It is one of my better illusions. The story of the Passover is a hard story in many ways. Moses asks Pharaoh to free those who are enslaved, and Pharaoh, unsurprisingly, says no. And God brings 10 plagues to the land: boils, hail, frogs, the death of all the livestock. And every time Pharaoh agrees to let the people go, and every time God hardens his heart and he rescinds and something terrible happens again, finally, when everyone is hungry because there are no crops and no livestock and dead animals are piled up everywhere, God pulls out one last horrific plan. He tells the Jewish people to kill a goat and paint the blood over the doors of their houses. And then he sends an angel to kill the firstborn of every house. But he passes over the Jewish houses. Well, this is enough for even Pharaoh. And he tells the Jewish people that they can go, but they don't trust him very much by this point, nor should they. And so they don't wait for the bread to rise. They just slap some quick crackers and grab a few possessions and run, which was a good idea in retrospect because surely enough, the Egyptian army chases after them. But God has one more trick up his sleeve, and he commands Moses to lead the people into the Red Sea, into the actual water. Moses argues a bit. This seems like a crazy plan, but they do it, and as the story goes, the water parts until the people fleeing are through it, and then the Egyptian army who has come after them gets drowned. The Seder commemorates all of this, as Joyce told us earlier. The tears of slavery are represented by dipping parsley in the salt water and eating it. Horseradish, the bitter herb, the bitterness of slavery, is eaten on matzah, which represents the unleavened bread that they fled with. Haroset, my daughter's favorite, the well-chopped mixture of apples and walnuts and cinnamon, represents the mortar of the bricks that the slaves were forced to build. The dinner continues with 4 glasses of wine, representing freedom from slavery and exile. They're really small glasses of wine in most houses. And the recitation of the 10 plagues, the invitation to Elijah to come and join us because we know what it is like to be strangers in a strange land. We sing Dayenu, it would have been enough, a prayer of gratitude for everything along the way. We talk about what we wish to be free from today, those things which still enslave us. But liberation was hard fought, because before the Jewish people were led into the promised land, they spent 40 years in exile in the desert. 40 years. Many of the folks who had been enslaved didn't live another 40 years. Many new folks were born in the desert, in that in-between time and place. And so today I am thinking of the 1 step forward and 2 steps back that feels so prevalent in politics today. It is almost impossible to imagine that Roe versus Wade, which was settled law for 50 years, has been overturned. We are so used to the arc of the universe bending toward justice, in the paraphrase of Martin Luther King Jr. But MLK was paraphrasing Unitarian minister and abolitionist Theodore Parker, preaching in 1853, who actually said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, and my eye reaches just a little way. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight. I can only divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure that it bends towards justice." Although Donald Trump's time in the White House is over, his legacy, especially in the form of many, many judicial appointments, is cemented. Elements of science and social progress that many of us counted on are being legislated out of existence by social conservatives trying to reform the country in their image. And sadly, one of the ways that they are doing that most effectively are by using children as pawns. Florida is banning books that talk about systemic racism and curriculum that shares some of the painful but true parts of our history because they don't want white kids to feel bad about being white. But many states are passing or trying to pass laws that take medical care for transgender kids away from parents and doctors and make trans kids feel not only bad about being trans, but downright invisible. You don't exist. We are going to legislate you out of the picture. In the last 3 months, just the last 3 months, Utah, Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Iowa, Georgia, Idaho, and Kentucky have all passed laws that deny children and teens and their parents and doctors the right to make their own healthcare decisions. These laws prohibit the use of puberty blockers or other reversible healthcare treatments for gender affirmation. And in some cases, they prevent a teacher from using a teenager's preferred pronouns, even if the kid and their parents agree what those are. In the early 1990s, a woman named Sharon Bottom lost custody of her 2-year-old son to her mother after a Virginia court ruled that because she was a lesbian, she was an unfit parent. Her home was inherently unfit. The ruling was overturned on appeal, but then went to the Virginia Supreme Court, which decided that since Ms. Bottoms was living in a lesbian relationship, that, quote, living daily under conditions stemming from active lesbianism practiced in the home may impose a burden upon the child by reason of the social condemnation attached to such an arrangement. It's not our job to change society. It's our job to change you. This story came out when I was a lesbian who knew that I wanted to have kids and be a parent. I was 25 years old, and it seems to me, and it still seems to me, that the right to parent your own children, providing you're not abusing your children, is about as fundamental a right as it gets. And just like everyone gets to decide who they love, everyone gets to decide who they are. I know so many trans adults, some of whom knew from an early age, and others who realized this in their 50s. I know so many non-binary and genderqueer adults and children who know deeply that the gender binary doesn't fit them. And I know trans kids who are super, super clear that they are not the gender that they were assigned at birth. To deny those kids and adults, and let's be clear, we're just protecting the children is BS. They will be coming for the adults soon enough. The right to exist with dignity is harmful and cruel. Keeping kids from puberty blockers and safe bathrooms and being addressed in the way they want to be addressed is just violence and will lead to more kids hurting themselves. Every medical intervention done to kids under 18 is reversible. They don't do surgery on kids. But what if they change their mind is a false argument because puberty-blocking medication can be stopped, and physical changes that were suppressed will happen. A study done by the Washington Post and KFF surveys confirmed that most transgender adults were happier after transitioning. And one of the other major takeaways from that survey is that nearly 2/3 of trans adults don't identify as a trans man or a trans woman, but instead as genderqueer or non-binary. The boxes we were so attached to for so long aren't so clear-cut anymore. And so things like single-stall restrooms, pronoun pins, letting people be who they are some basic, easy things that all of us need to be doing. Friday was Transgender Day of Visibility. Let's celebrate those who don't fit into the gender boxes. There are more of them than you realize. Other things that we can do to make a more fair and just world for everyone include sending money to organizations fighting these laws and supporting local school boards and candidates. School boards have been the places that many of these restrictions began, and so far the right has been much more likely than the left to invest in local government races. We may be safer with the federal races at this moment, but there is an incredible amount of power in what happens in local schools. Let's support Anna Farmer and Chelsea King and other local school board members who are trying to protect rights for all of our kids. It's important. Right now, we're going to watch a short message from the Unitarian Universalist Association and from religious professionals to trans and non-binary UUs and parents and supporters of trans and non-binary kids. A friend of mine is a UU minister in Idaho who has a transgender daughter. This is so painful and so personal. Let's support them in whatever ways we can.
This is a message to trans and non-binary people across the United States, to the parents of trans and non-binary kids, and to everyone who's showing up at state legislatures across the country, fighting the wave of anti-trans legislation that's sweeping this nation. We see you.
I see you putting our faith into action with your unwavering love and belief in the worth and dignity of trans kids. And we are here to remind you that you are not alone.
And you should know that Unitarian Universalists across the country, we have your back.
It's so hard right now. I read the stories of legislatures and politicians and people seeking attention, using your lives, your heart, your body as political pawns, as punching bags, literal and figurative.
Fearing politicians will use your kids as political pawns, will force you to move states, uprooting your lives, all because you want your kids to thrive, to receive medically necessary health care, to play sports, to be themselves, to be safe, to feel loved and wanted as they deserve.
It is exhausting and frustrating. It is scary sometimes.
Every day you are feeling the weight of hateful lies pushing on you and on those kids that you love. We see you showing up to protest and to testify and to organize and to lobby. Thank you for showing up for our values. Thank you for fighting for trans and non-binary kids. And I know that for you, just like for me, this isn't some kind of abstract agenda.
There are folks in my congregation here who are trans, who are non-binary, who are going to be the direct recipients of the work that you're doing.
Thank you from trans members of my congregation. Thank you from parents of trans kids in my congregation.
Thank you for being in this. When everything feels like it's arrayed against you, when it feels like you take one step forward and 2 steps back, it gives me hope that you're out doing this work, as draining as it can be sometimes. We see you and we care for you, and we're so, so grateful for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
At Unitarian Universalism, we believe that every person is beautiful as they are and as they are becoming.
That your life is sacred, your body is sacred, just as you are, and that they're wrong. They're wrong, they're cynical, they want you to give up, and love is stronger than their fear.
Too often, people of faith end up on the side of hatred and discrimination towards LGBTQ+ people. But that ends here.
Trans kids are not political pawns. Trans kids are divine.
None of us, to the best of my knowledge, have been literally enslaved. And yet we still understand what it is to be ravenous for freedom. To want ourselves and our neighbors and our children to be their truest selves. To shine bright, safe, and beloved and whole, just as we and they are. May it ever be so. Blessed be, and amen.